All right, now, joining us, ironically, not on that particular issue, but to talk about events that have been occurring a long way away from us, which still have meaning and consequence, is Peter Thompson, Victoria University. We are particularly talking around the Fox case, the enormous media institution that is Fox and Rupert Murdoch, their empire, losing that defamation case, well, settling their defamation case with Dominion voting systems. But what might come out of that as a consequence? Peter Thompson, Victoria University, joins us. Peter, good morning to you.
Good morning.
First of all, going back, just before we talk about, and you'll have a personal view, being an employee of Victoria University, Otago University, their announcement yesterday of cutting hundreds of staff, many of academic consequence of a hole in their budget, does that send a shudder through the whole tertiary institutions in this country? Or do you think it's confined just to Dunedin?
I think it sends a shudder through the entire sector, to be honest. It's not the first employment issue that we've seen in recent years. AUT's had some really serious and in fact legal challenges over its decision to make staff redundant. The curious thing about the Otago news, and I don't know all the details, so I'm cautious in my statement, is that it seems that their revenues are down 1%, and so the numbers of redundancies they're talking about seem entirely disproportionate. But I've got to say this comes on the back of really what seems to be systematic underfunding across the sector. The universities aren't cheap institutions, but they've been struggling, and the government hasn't done a great deal to support them.
Yeah, well, I wonder though if, and by preamble, that I've got this right, we have too many universities for a country our size. If we're going to have excellence in our tertiary institutions, do we actually need to reduce them and concentrate, well, the good people, in a fewer institutions?
Oh, well, that's an interesting argument. I mean, there could be arguments for rationalisation in some particular areas, but I think by and large, I mean, we've only got half a dozen, universities, and of course, a kind of a rather complex organisation in the Polytech sector, which you've just been talking about. I mean, the difficulty is that if you say, right, we're only going to do medicine, at Auckland, or we're only going to do dentistry at Otago, that doesn't necessarily appeal to everybody. It's a big enough country to sustain a number of universities. There isn't a great deal of waste, I've got to say. Sometimes we get a bad press, but no, I think by and large, the universities have been struggling for some time, and they certainly haven't had their funding keeping up with inflation. And one of the big problems we had really since COVID was that the universities and the tertiary sector as a whole has relied a great deal on attracting students from overseas. And even though the restrictions on student immigration have largely been lifted, there's still a huge backlog of problems. I mean, we know students that have been offered places that just can't get the visas processed in time. Now that's not the university's fault. It's that's just a systemic problem with immigration. But that's put a huge hole in university budgets, and certainly in some subject areas, it's quite a critical issue.
You're actually quite an interesting man, because you came here, I think, about a decade ago, just over a decade ago, to New Zealand. But you had... I
came here in 97.
97, that's right. You came to, and you went to Victoria University in 2011. But you had actually lectured overseas in Thailand, Singapore, and also Leicester University in the UK. Can I ask you, going through those, what's the major point of difference between New Zealand universities and the institutions in which you'd previously taught, do you think? Is it the funding?
Well, I think the funding it depends where you go. In the UK, there's quite a number of universities that are struggling. I mean, if you compare us with, say, NTU in Singapore, we're massively underfunded. If you compare us with the US universities, many of which have massive philanthropic endowments, worth billions, the level of funding for research and support for for lecture delivery is just incomparable. So there's sometimes this idea that universities are some sort of smug and very comfortably funded institutions, but my experience is that staff work extremely hard, probably harder than some of our colleagues overseas, to be fair, and that really the level of funding that we see in New Zealand for the tertiary sector doesn't compare well with institutions overseas.
And just before, again, we get on to what we're going to talk about, but I mean, unfortunately, events have overtaken us, but it's really interesting to get your insight into this. University rankings, I went to university a long time ago, as you've probably worked out. There were no international rankings that were of relevance to us. Have they now become a big deal, not just for universities in particular, but for departments within universities as well? Not a big deal at the departmental level, although there's always a pressure to perform in the PBRF scheme, the performance-based research fund rankings. There's always bragging rights available on systems like QS, and I've got to say my personal view is that these systems are methodologically rubbish. They don't measure quality. I'll give you an example. QS rankings, really pretty random. They just send a whole bunch of academics a link to go and fill in a form about who they rate as the top universities, and it's really reputation that drives a lot of that rather than any objective measure. PBRF is a bit different. That's an extremely detailed process. Now, whether it measures research quality in a perfect way, I think you could quibble, but it certainly measures something, and it certainly puts pressure on academics to produce publishable, quality assured research. So I think it's the local systems that translate into an imperative to produce high quality research outputs. The QS rankings are really quite coincidental. Yeah, there's also something, though, called the Times Higher Education. They do the World University Rankings every year as well. I assume that the Times of London or Britain is behind those. Do they have some sort of status with you as well?
Yeah, again, if it's, if you can get into the upper ranks, you can use it as bragging for your marketing. But it doesn't really translate into, the Vice-Chancellor coming along and saying, now you've dropped in the Times Education ranking 5 points, over the last 2 years. Come on, you better buck your ideas up. That doesn't happen. If it was PBRF, that might be a different story. So no, they're nice to have bragging rights rather than a driving imperative, behind the way that the institutions work. I think Times probably is a bit more methodologically systematic than QS, but again, you've got to ask what exactly they're measuring. If even if you ask graduates, you can say, how much did you enjoy your degree? Do you feel that you got good value for money? How much did you learn? But of course, what they can't tell you is, would they have done better or had a better time if they'd gone to the institution, at the other side of town? So you've got to take all these rankings with a big pinch of salt, I think.
Well, that's fair enough. I note, though, that universities do have reputations, and students will choose to go to a university often based upon that reputation. Yeah, I mean, for example, you I think you run the media studies program at, or you joined the media studies program at Victoria University. You're the associate professor there of English film, theatre, media, communication, art history, which is a lot. But you have a reputation, that particular school in New Zealand, and that reputation attracts students, yeah?
It does, yeah. I think, it attracts local students. I think where the QS rankings or the Times rankings probably work more is for the international students, because they don't have friends and family that can say, hey, you're interested in doing English or you're interested in doing communication studies, I went there, this is a really good department. You don't get that network of feedback within the within the international context, so they can only go on how these institutions present themselves. And it's not just the rankings. Most of the institutions have, international marketing agents that will go to education fairs overseas, where they give out information, highlight what the university does that's different or particularly special. And from that, you get the students. But of course, all of that depends on their visas. And at the moment, there's still a huge backlog, and it's causing a big problem.
All right. Now, the real reason I got you on the show, thank you, though, for digressing on that, because as you know, that decision yesterday afternoon is, well, as I say, it's going to shutters through the tertiary sector, but certainly sending shutters through Otago University at the moment. Now, we were talking about earlier in the week, obviously, Fox News and their settlement with particularly Dominion voting systems. Looking from an outside in, your take on that? My initial reaction of that was, I think they probably both got out of it what they wanted to. Fox wanted to get out of a very difficult situation and probably has, and it's cost them a lot of money. And Dominion voting systems have got their reputation back. But what's your interpretation?
I'd actually agree with you there, Michael. I think Fox realised that the writing was on the wall. The release of the internal documents that actually showed that senior executives and their fact-checking unit called Brainbox had assessed the claims about the vote rigging systems to be false, really put them in a difficult situation. But the important thing to note is that this wasn't about suing Fox for producing false news. These were defamation lawsuits, and it comes from a context where the US First Amendment has a very, very high level of protection for free speech and news media in particular, even if they're producing false news. And so the defamation suit stemmed from the fact that there were claims of economic harm coming from Dominion and also another group called Smartmatics, the legal case of which is still being processed. And so the defamation suit was based on the fact that they could claim to have suffered economic harm because they were disparaged on Fox's news programs. And there were multiple cases of this. I mean, Maria Bartiromo was interviewing Sidney Powell, who's a big Trump supporter. And she says, Sydney, we talked about the Dominion software. I know that there were voting irregularities. So they're making these false claims directly. And then there was Lou Dobbs also interviewing Powell, where basically he's invited by Dobbs to make these claims, and Powell says, "Oh, I can hardly wait to put forth all the evidence we collected on Dominion, starting with the fact it was created to produce altered voting results in Venezuela for Hugo Chavez, and then shipped internationally to manipulate votes for purchase in other countries, including this one. And this is all patently false, and they knew it. And the reason this is really important is because to actually winning a defamation case isn't straightforward either. It's not just the case that you said something bad about me that was untrue. You've actually got to show that there was malice, and that means that it was a deliberate falsehood, that was harmful. And clearly they met that criteria, and that's the reason why they've settled out of court. Now, the market logic of that is probably that apparently they put billions aside for the law case. They knew it could have gone even worse, but they were probably thinking, well, look, if we hold off, we might end up paying more, and our reputation, having had our dirty laundry aired in public, might actually decline to such a degree that we lose viewers and advertisers and sponsors. So they probably thought, gosh, we'd better bite the bullet and pay up, and that will at least get Dominion off our backs. They haven't done that with Smartmatics so far. And we don't know whether they're going to take the same approach, but Smartmatics is obviously going to make very, very similar claims based on the very, very similar evidence. So, I don't know whether they'll hold out and take it to court or not.
Well, the other thing, looking at taking the lens back and looking at it, is that Fox knew that Biden had won, Trump had lost, that the claims are false. But it seems driven by a commercial imperative not to lose its largely Republican base audience by stating such. And they had also made themselves unpopular with that base by calling one of the seats. I said I thought it was Ohio, but it wasn't. It was another seat that they called early for Biden. And so the clear link is between delivering news to a group and it has a commercial imperative. So you've created a group of people who listen or view you. You now structure the news to the audience that you've attracted to the station. And I wonder what the implications are of that internationally, to be honest with you, because that would seem to be the model that is being used throughout the world. I've got this market, they think like this, I'll now structure and tailor my news to fit my audience. Is that a problem that all of the media have in the Western world?
To a degree, I'd say yes. I mean, by and large, all news media, they don't necessarily have a strong ideological bias, but you've got to tell the news from a perspective, and that will tend to reflect the assumptions of the audience, and a lot of that is unconscious. Just reflecting news as a genre in a particular country and the sorts of issues and angles and frames that the audience is used to. But Fox, I think, is a special case. It's interesting that it's actually owned by Fox Corporation. So it's not part of News Corp. It's kind of the entertainment arm. So it's a very different sort of a beast. And I think what this case revealed is some quite interesting internal conflicts of interest within the company. I mean, Murdoch certainly had gone cool on Trump, especially post-Capitol riots. He was quite scathing. I think he was actually worried about reputational damage of Fox continuing to back him. But internally there were some of the anchors. I think I read something about Maria Bartiromo, writing a memo to other people saying, we've got to back Trump, we've got to keep him in office. So there was very, very strong, political bias there. Other editors, though, were unsure, and this is where they passed the claims about the rigged election through to their fact-checking group called Brainbox, and they come up going, "Oh no, this doesn't look right." In fact, we think it's probably false. And then either because of institutional ideology and/or a concern to maintain this narrative to the Fox viewership, to maintain ratings, they kept running the stories even when they were getting legal complaints from these voting system companies. So I think there's kind of been some schisms internally that are quite problematic, and I think it does reveal the conflict that you point to, which is that if you're dependent on basically selling audience eyeballs to advertisers, then you need to be very cognizant of what it is that your audience expects. And if they've come to expect a particular jingoistic narrative that backs, well, for the sake of Fox, nearly always backs the Republicans, then any deviation from that narrative causes a bit of disgruntlement. Now, against that, they've got to assess also their reputational damage, because not everybody that watches Fox is a dyed-in-the-wool Trump supporter that really doesn't care about the evidence. They're just going to back the guy anyway. There's a lot of middle-of-the-road Republicans that are looking at this going, well, gee, I thought Fox News was straight, and they said it was fair and balanced. Wait a minute, it's not. And so I guess they've got to be worried not just about the partisan Trump supporters. They've got to be worried about the middle-of-the-road Republicans and other Americans, who do watch Fox and now are seeing it being questioned in terms of its journalistic integrity.
Now, if I can extrapolate, though, the general theme of what we've just been talking about in the last 5 minutes back to New Zealand, the Public Interest Journalism Fund would again seem to have that imperative, wouldn't it? There's a government saying, listen, we're going to bail you out with $50-odd million in New Zealand because your institutions are in some financial difficulty, but we're going to attach some strings to, the things that we consider are important and editorially in terms of giving you that money. Is there a danger here, and I am referring it to New Zealand, but I'm also thinking throughout the Western world, that our news now is being manipulated by those who pay the money, or has it always been the case in the media that the news has always been manipulated by those who have the money?
There's always an argument for following the money and looking at how the dependency on the decision makers of funders might influence the way that the company operates. That's always a good question to ask. I have to say that the Public Interest Journalism Fund has been badly misunderstood and also badly misrepresented in some media. The reality is, and I've spoken to the people at New Zealand Air and some of the people that helped design the scheme, it seemed to change in the process of being implemented. It started off as a kind of an emergency fund during the pandemic to try and keep some of the news media that was struggling afloat, especially after Biomedia shut all its magazines, most of which have now been recovered in some shape or form. But in the process, that by the time they got the things set up, most of the news media, and particularly the print news media, had started to come out the other end and were looking, if not entirely healthy. Then at least they were no longer in intensive care, and so somewhere in the process there was a decision taken to say let's go beyond. Just giving you money to keep you doing what you're currently doing. We want this money to serve a public service interest. And I think there's been some real nonsense written about, it's got to be biased towards Maori. They wanted to increase the level of Maori reporting because historically that's been underreported. There haven't been very many Maori perspectives, in the news relative to the mainstream. And so some of the money was spent on creating Maori news beats. Some of it was put into a fund to train reporters on Maori issues. And I think you'd have to be pretty jaundiced to say that there wasn't a case for doing that. Somewhere in the process, though, there's been this framing where this is supposed to be editorial interference. And I think here you have to differentiate between two very important things. There's one thing to say, as say with Radio New Zealand, say, right, you've got a public charter, you're funded by the government, although it goes through New Zealand Air, but the law says that the government cannot phone up the editor and say, hey, we want you to tell this story in this way, or we want you to drop that story because it's embarrassing. That level of editorial interference doesn't naturally accrue from the funding model. And I've got to say there's quite a lot of folk on the right that like to make that assertion, and they're wrong. Empirically, they're wrong. Can I just test you?
Can I just test you on that? I've seen the contracts that New Zealand Air have given to staff, and one of them is the need to accept the principles of the Te Tiriti o Waitangi, for example, which is, it seems to me, an odd connection to draw if you're going to be giving money for to news agencies to essentially improve the value and restore the balance sheet of some of these organisations. Don't you think? I mean, I think to me, because it would seem to me that if I
can see the argument.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see the argument, but I think that presupposes that one's politicising the treaty rather than saying that that's actually just is a fundamental document for the relationship between Maori and the Crown within New Zealand, and therefore we ought to be cognisant of that in the way that informs the way we report on Maori issues.
Yeah, but it means if I want to run a contrarian,
I didn't see that as controversial.
Well, Peter, but if I want to run a contrary narrative, for example, if I want to say, in an article or in an opinion piece that I think that the Treaty of Waitangi is the problem in terms of holding Maori back as a people and in terms of, education attainment, blah, 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 sort of mainstream stuff that Winston Peters has been running for the last 30 years, I'm going to find that very hard to do if there's a part there in the funding that I've taken that says my job is to promote this. Now that means that anything that runs a contrary negative has the danger or the damage of being discarded and not becoming part of the public discussion as a consequence of the conditions under which I've taken that money, yes?
Okay. So, hearing your argument, well, here would be my response to that. And if the news media were all run on that principle, then you might have an argument. But the fact is that the fund was made available to support the production of news that wouldn't normally happen under a commercial model, either because it was too niche, or it would, it wasn't commercially attractive, or it would deal with issues that otherwise wouldn't get a big audience. I mean, the local democracy reporting scheme is another one, right? Now, that's done some absolutely fantastic stories about local government and issues that previously, the news media by and large was saying we can't afford reporters to cover all this stuff. And so I think if you look at it in that frame, you get a different picture.
I accept, Peter, I accept what you say. I accept that in some areas...
compensatory model.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that it wasn't a perfect scheme for the reasons that I've suggested to you. But the really interesting thing is, this $55 million is running out. Now, this is the last year, and it seems to me that all that investment
the last round
is all over. So if I've created 20 extra jobs, let's just say, as Stuff have, for doing provincial news, and now that money isn't to pay those journalists in those particular areas doing that provincial news, doesn't that mean that when the money runs out, so do those jobs?
Well, quite possibly, unfortunately. I mean, I think Stuff's an interesting case because it's created its own, even though it's a private company now, it's created its own, journalistic charter. And in Potiaki, it's got a commitment to trying to cover issues from a Maori perspective. So, and insofar as the Public Interest Journalism Fund was intended to support that kind of content, again, I don't think it was producing things that were, ideologically biased. I mean, it just offered perspectives that perhaps we wouldn't see normally. But I would agree, though, that now we're at risk that some of those jobs, at least, will disappear with the funding. So, and therein lies a crisis of the news media, I think. We know that the news media have lost, if we go back 20 years, their share of the overall advertising spend in New Zealand has declined by about 2/3, even up to nearly 3/4 now. I mean, that's just a massive decline of income, and it's partly because we don't buy newspapers anymore, but a large part of it is because a lot of the digital advertising, in fact, probably over half the digital advertising, has now gone to digital platforms, notably Google and Facebook. So they've had this ongoing debate about how to rectify that. There's been the collective bargaining agreement that was approved by the Commerce Commission, but now it seems to have been superseded by some other arrangements, between bilateral arrangements between Google and different news media. So I think one way to the question I think we come to is that, if you don't want the government funding news media because it raises questions about its independence. I mean, for me, you also got questions about advertiser funding for the reasons that we discussed in relation to Fox. How should we fund an independent news media? Now, for me, one model of this would be to look at a small levy, a bit like the Telecommunications Development Fund, on digital advertising and maybe other forms of commercial revenues, and you take a very, very small part of that and put it in a pot and have an independent agent like New Zealand On Air, disburse it. So, if you imagine taking a cut of the digital advertising spend that's currently captured by Google and Facebook, and you gave that funding to the news media, that would probably cover the cost of the Public Interest Journalism Fund, and it would then be coming from an independent source. So that's the way I'd square that circle.
Okay, which raises the next issue, of course, of the independence of media in general. There's been a recent survey conducted by Curia Research, who a very credible very credible polling agency now, that asked New Zealanders, it was published last week, you've probably seen it, Peter, how do you perceive, I think they gave 8 institutions, including the platform, and said, how do you perceive these in terms of where they sit on the political spectrum? You've seen that survey, the survey results?
Oh, I'm aware of it. I actually haven't read it, I'm afraid.
Okay. But the public perception seems to be that most of New Zealand media leans to the left and liberal from that particular survey. Would you accept that that is a fair premise, that most media in this country is left liberal in terms of its outlook and its editorial perception?
It depends how you define left and liberal. I mean, liberals are a slippery definition anyway, particularly because in the States, liberals are on the right. Sorry, I mean, in an economic sense, but on the left in a cultural sense. And I think that's possibly a very useful distinction. That you can have cultural liberals who, for example, would support gay marriage and transgender rights and other cultural aspects of identity that are considered left. I don't know why it's considered left. I tend to see it as a human rights issue. But then you've got the other question about the political and the economic side of things. And if you're an economic liberal, then you're typically on the political right.
Well, no, I think they do mean cultural. I
think they mean cultural, and so I think the tendency for this, I mean, first of all, is quite a lot of right-wing commentators make a fuss about what they see as liberal bias. I mean, there's quite a few studies that have actually shown that it generally works in the other direction. But I would agree partially that the news media, being concerned to appeal to a wide audience, in the case of public service media, being obliged to appeal to a wide audience and be inclusive, tend to be quite careful about the way that they represent issues of race and gender and the rest of it. I don't think that necessarily means it's terribly biased, but it does mean that it's sensitive to a certain range of issues that perhaps other people think is inappropriate. But then if you ask the other question, about the economic and the political side, then I think it works completely in the other direction. The extent to which the news reports accept economic orthodoxy is overwhelming.
Yeah. No, I accept that. But I'll give you the question. It was actually, they used the words leaning left, leaning right. So what they meant was that they used the words left and right and centre. So they didn't use the word liberal.
It's pretty vague, isn't it?
Yeah. I think most New Zealanders would know what it means.
The problem that individuals will have a different sense of what they think left and right is.
Oh, well, that's what you're asking. You're asking perceptions at the end of the day, and I mean, when we come to vote in 6 months' time,
of course,
Peter, we'll vote on perceptions, won't we, rather than necessarily what is the actuality. Hey, listen, it's been really nice to talk to you. You are the associate professor. Yeah, you are the associate professor. If we don't mind, we'll stay in contact with you. You bring an interesting perspective, and I wish you well. And I hope that you and your colleagues are not having endangered jobs by the end of this year.
I don't know. Well, hopefully I haven't upset everybody by this interview.
Listen, free speech. That's what the platform's about. Thank you very much for your time, Peter.
Okay. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. All right. Now, Peter Thompson was listen, you won't necessarily agree with everything he said or his perceptions, but I think it's important to hear what they were. There you go.